Let's talk about Labour's brand new third world corruption scandal. Now, if you are outside of the UK and aren't permanently plugged into our news cycle, like we three are, you might not be familiar with this name. Well, unless you live in Bangladesh. And that is Tulip Siddiq. Now, Tulip Siddiq was the Shadow Education and Treasury Minister when Labour were in opposition since 2016. She was elected in 2014. She's now the member for the new constituency of Hampstead and Highgate, but she's been around for ages. And she's been the Treasury Secretary since the election on the 9th of July. Until yesterday. This is important. She was Keir Starmer's close personal friend. She was also his anti-corruption minister, and she's resigned for a corruption probe. Don't you just love politics in this country? It's going so well for Labour at the moment, isn't it? I'm bet you're thinking, yeah, the fact that we split from them quite a while ago.
A long time ago. Yeah, no, it's long gone. Yeah.
Yes. So a bit of background on what the corruption probe actually is. So it's related to the fact that her aunt, so she's the niece of Sheikh Hasina, and Sheikh Hasina until last year was the longest serving female head of state and the longest serving prime minister in Bangladesh. And she was the leader of something called the Awami League, which was the ruling party at the time. And they were basically an unbroken chain of rulers since 1971 when they had their war for independence. And Josh actually covered this a little while ago in a segment on the website about the revolution happening in Bangladesh. So what ended up happening was Hasina's dad was the first PM of Bangladesh after independence, and then they played ethnic familial clientele politics by allotting about 5% of all government jobs to families of the people that fought for the War of Independence. They then also allotted at least 2% for DEI work, like transgender people and racial minorities and all that. So they were a kind of secular, UN-aligned government that tried to keep the Islamic and the Hindu minority factions under control. And after the Supreme Court ruled that that was going to be the portion, there were a bunch of student riots that then turned into Islamic riots. So they burned down Hindu temples and chained Hindu women to fence posts and things like that. And so Hasina, when they started gathering outside the Prime Minister's quarters, fled on a helicopter to India and has been in hiding ever since. So there were allegations that her government were despotic and that they locked up certain political dissidents. So she wasn't the most cuddly and cosy lover of human rights leader, which is a bit inconvenient when you've got a senior member of the Labour Party who's also related to her and seems particularly concerned about Bangladeshi politics back in her family's country. So the corruption probe, specifically on Siddiq's case, there were officials over at the ACC, which is now the ruling party in Bangladesh. Apparently, Hasina had allotted plots of land in 2022 in collaboration with senior officials of the, and this is going to be very difficult for me to pronounce, Rajhani Union Kartipaka, so Rajuk, thank you, which is the Capital Development Authority in Bangladesh. So Rajuk is apparently responsible for urban planning and development in the Dhaka metropolitan area. And so she was giving, let's say, preferential treatment to her political allies for development in the area. And this was to do with Tulip Siddiq. And there's also another claim about £4 billion of embezzlement for Sheikh Hasina. So her aunt
comes with all the territory, doesn't it?
A lot of money.
Yeah, not exactly pocket change to find down the back of the sofa.
So what you're telling me is the third world government was corrupt.
I know, knock you down with a feather.
Yeah, I'm shocked. Yeah. Are you now going to begin advocating that we should bring that sort of corruption here?
Well, it looks like it might possibly already be.
Well, I mean, that's what our government has already been doing for a long time.
Well, quite. So Siddiq has denied all wrongdoing, and she said that her ownership of properties possibly maybe linked to her very corrupt and despotic aunt is, any suggestion is categorically wrong. Problem.
It's like all of those houses that Angela Rayner owns.
A little
bit different. I mean, on reading it, the odd thing about this is her puzzlement or equivocation about who gave her a particular flat in London, who donated, because apparently someone just gave her a flat, like as a gift.
Do.
Yeah, as a gift. And part of the inquiry, the recent inquiry and the cause of the trouble now, the proximate cause, is that there was a lack of clarity about her account of who gave her that flat. Was it her mother? Was it a family member? Was it a property developer in Bangladesh, which apparently it turns out to be? But the odd thing is that you can't like a salient person isn't really equivocal about this stuff, I mean, fair enough, if it's Christmas and you've got a chocolate orange, 6 months later, say, yeah, who gave you the chocolate? I'm not really sure, it was really nice. But, but a flat that you live in, you ought to know
You've had
who
for 20
gave
years.
Yes, who gave it to you? Was it so that's the problem. And then the inquiry that we've just had and is published, the civil servant that had a look at it, the wording is very interesting because they, there's no evidence, but absence of evidence of corruption isn't evidence there was no corruption at all. So you don't know. He said that, but I think the reason she's gone is that it just looks terrible, absolutely terrible. And to be the person in the government that's responsible for corruption, but getting embroiled into that is a problem. But Conrad, I think the worst thing about this general issue is, and I'm talking general, I'm not talking about this case, that the appalling thing about this is that there are kleptocracies all over the third world, all over the world, right? And in this particular case, you're talking about £4 billion. These are very, very poor countries in many cases, right? And the leaders, basically steal, a lot of them steal from these countries. And then they'll end up in the Francophone world. They end up in Paris, and Paris does very well out of it. In the Lucifer world, they end up in Lisbon and Porto, eating in expensive restaurants, having skinned these countries. And in London, London's full of these people. We do nothing about it. We don't care. But remember that poor people in these countries are being ripped off, basically, by this. And I think it's appalling.
Well, it's also the fact that we allow wealthy foreign nationals
Not bothered.
just to buy up loads of our property.
Sure.
So it becomes a incentive to launder money that you might have gotten through ill-gotten means in different countries who have unilaterally liberal attitudes to property ownership and commerce, whereas your country is very ethnically, familially protectionist. I mean, her aunt was putting in place a regime where the families of the people that fought for independence were guaranteed government jobs despite their competency.
Yes, and we saw that, and that was the origin of the riots, and then a lot of people lost their lives, quite rightly objecting to that, because why should that be the case? It's crazy. But it just on a broader point, we tolerate it because we want the money, basically, but it's rotten, absolutely rotten to the core. And anyone that thinks, this is one of the things that, progressive liberals don't really get and don't want to believe, but it happens to be true on the evidence, is that most of these countries around the world are pretty corrupt. Go to Transparency International, have a look at the corruption index, and have a look at the extent of corruption. It's normalized. There are probably only about 40 countries in out of the 180, 190 that have reasonable levels of non-corruption, and there's a league table, there's a hierarchy, but Bangladesh is one of the most corrupt countries in the world.
Yeah, and it's excellent that we're sourcing lots of immigration there, and I can't possibly think of any drawbacks of allowing someone who has direct familial interest in the politics of that country up in the highest echelons of our government, as we can see. So a couple of details on the flat, and also to answer your question, Harry, about whether or not it's, well, is it confirmed or is it a bit like Angela Rayner's place? There's a link to the Labour Party coming up. So the flat in question, she got it in King's Cross in 2004, prime bit of London real estate. And the filings indicate that the donor was a man named Abdul Muttalif, who's a property developer linked to her aunt. And, well, despite them saying there's absolutely no suggestion that she could have got this through ill-gotten means because of her aunt's influence, after the Prime Minister's residence was sacked by the protesters when she left, it's funny because apparently the Times is reporting that there were Labour flyers and a thank you letter for helping Siddiq get elected found in the ransacked house. So there was, let's say, a lot of familial cross-pollination.
Do you think, I saw that, but do you think that's surprising? I mean, they are a family, right? So her aunt would want her elected. Naturally, she'd want her elected.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I saw
that.
I thought, well...
So the idea that there is absolutely no transmission between the British Labour Party and the regime in Bangladesh, as you said, evidence of not having
absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence.
Yeah, there's clearly a suggestion of a permeable barrier here, to say the least. So the idea that she's going, well, we had absolutely no idea and there's nothing untoward to see here.
Yeah, and the other thing that was interesting is the rather, let's say, embarrassing for the Labour Party photograph of Tulip Siddiq over with Putin and her aunt. Do you see that photo?
No, I didn't.
It's out there, if you look for it, yeah. So it's there, so I was invited along, nothing to see here. Nothing much to see here.
Yeah, as much as she wants to then say that she's done nothing wrong.
Not connected, yeah.
Yeah, literally the next day she's resigned. Womp womp. She referred herself to Sir Laurie Magnus, who's the Keir Starmer's ethics advisor. I didn't realise he had one. He might want to get a new one because he's not exactly doing very well at the moment. And then she wrote a letter to Starmer yesterday saying... Sir Laurie said that he should consider her ongoing. She should reconsider her ongoing responsibilities, even though he didn't believe the ministerial code had been breached. So, even though he didn't hold her up on an actual ethics complaint, he was still saying something looks a bit squirrely here. So, not a good look to have an anti-corruption minister being investigated for corruption. And so she's now resigned, saying that it's likely to be a distraction from the work of the government. Right, so the problem is not that you might have done something wrong. The problem is that the headlines about you possibly doing something wrong is going to distract from all of the other errors that the Labour Party is making.
Which is true as well. I mean, they don't want that, and it's just very, very unfortunate that the government's person in charge of corruption is sort of linked in some way to other corruption inquiries in other jurisdictions.
Yeah, and then... Okay, so as you said, is it a good idea to import this very familial nepotistic politics over? It turns out the government's doing that anyway because her replacement's been announced, right? And I saw this in the Telegraph. I'm just going to have to read from it. So she'll be replaced as Economic Secretary to the Treasury by Emma Reynolds. And Emma Reynolds was Work and Pensions Minister. So she's going to be succeeded by Torsten Bell, who ran the Resolution Foundation before becoming an MP, and who is the twin brother of a guy called Olaf Henriksen Bell, who's a career civil servant who recently became the head of the Number 10 Policy Unit. So they're literally just appointing each other's family members from permanent civil servants. Like, it's a big club. None of us will ever be in it, it turns out. And then there's the question of, okay, just how third world of politics are we going to get here? Because a little while ago, she was questioned about her untoward links with her aunt's regime, because one of the people that her aunt was supposedly imprisoning under spurious means was a British-trained barrister called Ahmad bin Qasim, good British name, and he was imprisoned by Siddiq's aunt for 8 years and was only freed after she was chucked out. And Siddiq was questioned by Channel 4 in 2017, one of the few times that Channel 4 has ever done anything sensible, when she was campaigning for the release of Nazarene Zaghari Radcliffe, the woman that was imprisoned in the Iranian regime. I think she used to work for Reuters, and then Boris Johnson and Liz Truss got her out. And she was asked, well, why don't you just make one phone call to your aunt to release this guy? And we've got video footage of what she said here, but she turned around to the journalist in question, who was pregnant at the time, and said, you want to be very careful. I'm British Member of Parliament, I'm not Bangladeshi, and the person you're talking about, I have no idea about their case. And then she said, thanks for coming, Daisy. Hope you have a great birth, because child labour is hard. See you.
Yeah, it's not very nice.
It
feels threatening, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's just,
really,
like, okay, the implication being what?
Yeah.
It's a bit...
It's creepy, actually.
Yeah, I'll play the footage just so we aren't mischaracterising her, but it's properly...
Absolutely disgraceful. You're disgraceful. Absolutely disgraceful. Disgraceful.
Leave the camera alone.
You're disgraceful.
MPs are there to answer questions. It's to ask her about her family connections to a regime.
Oh, sorry.
Very careful. Very careful. I am a British MP. Be very careful. Hi.
Very weird. Like, be very careful of what? Asking about your aunt's imprisonment, possibly strange imprisonment of a British trained barrister. What? Be very careful about what? Like, I can't help but think here that we shouldn't have to deal with any of this. Like, I shouldn't have to know the ins and outs of Bangladeshi politics just to know my own politics. We should not be importing this very kleptocratic, nepotistic, possibly corrupt, threat-based politics.
No, you don't want that, but you're likely going to make a broader point about a sort of academic point about types of immigration and what the true nature of it is. So I try and plug this thinker called Garrett Jones, who wrote a very important book called The Culture Transplant 2 years ago. He's an academic at George Mason in Washington. Brilliant book. And if you want to understand what's going on, please read this book. The book is Culture Transplant: Why Immigrants Make the Countries They Go To More Like the Countries They Came From. Sounds obvious. It's the sort of thing that, I mean, he shouldn't, as an economics professor, have to write this book, because people in pubs know this, right? This is the case. But on all the data, actually, assimilation is a bit of a myth. people go to a different place. Largely the cultural practices, beliefs, savings rates, a whole load of stuff that group has goes with them. I mean, you don't suddenly become like, if you come from if a group, because it's not individuals, but a population is transferred from a war-torn Middle East zone or Sub-Saharan Africa or another place and goes to Denmark, it doesn't suddenly become Danish. It really doesn't, and it won't. And actually, one of the problems is that progressives imagine that it can, or that it's reasonable even to ask that it should, because no one's on getting to a new place. I just forget all about my culture. No, culture migrates. That's his big point. So, broader point, I'm not talking about this case, but broader point, if you import a lot of people with belief system X to your country, it won't change very much, and it'll stay the same.
It's when you bring up Denmark and the Netherlands data that we've discussed before that they've collected, it just shows that first-generation migrants and their second and third-generation descendants repeat the economic and criminal participation patterns of their parents, which means that immigrants from the Middle East, North and often Sub-Saharan Africa, Pakistan and Turkey are, across their lifetimes, never net tax-paying contributors, whereas East Asian, American, Australian and Western European migrants are positive contributors around the middle of their lifetime when they're at their peak working age, as is the native Danish population.
But across the cycle they are as well. So then, Jan van der Beek's Borderless Europe, very good. I mean, I think it's a seminal bit of work, a couple of years old now, translated into English last year. And everyone should read it. And if you want evidence-based policy about migration, you have to look at this. You really must do.
Well, there's also the data, I think it's American data, looking into the patterns of nationalism towards the homelands that comes from first, second, and third generation immigrants. And they find that, if anything, the first generations who first got there are the ones that try the hardest to assimilate. And as you go through the generations, they get more and more nationalistic towards their original homelands.
They're in group, yeah. It can be the case.
The same thing happened in that policy exchange report. Oh no, it might have been the Henry Jackson Society report about the Islamic data from last year, and it said that 52% want to criminalize drawing of the Prophet Muhammad, 30% are happy with Sharia law, 75% think Hamas did nothing wrong, and it's mainly concentrated among British-born 18 to 30 males with a university degree.
Yeah.
So even though they're highly educated, even though they're supposedly economic net contributors, even though they've been born on the magic soil, it doesn't magically transmogrify.
There's no such thing. Yeah, magic soil doesn't exist. But you've just got. It's one of these points you've got to get across. And it's a very clever book. His book is mainly about Southeast Asia, and he looks in particular at Chinese diasporas. Fascinating. The stability of things like the Chinese savings rate across all, Chinese populations in Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, China itself, Taiwan, and the United States, pretty much the same. The savings rate is pretty similar, high savings rate, and we shouldn't be surprised. The equation is savings equal investment, investment equals future prosperity, and that's why you get a group that outperforms as well as all the other things. So if you transport a population from A to B, the population will give you what they had in the first place.
It should also be really obvious by remittance rates, because a large amount of the economy of these countries, I think it's India, is like 180 billion every single year.
It's far bigger than foreign aid. Far.
Exactly. So that means that the people that are in this country have loyalties to their homeland and the people living in that homeland. So they're not going to spend money that they're earning here in the national economy. They're just sending it back.
And that's why as a model, if you've got your eyes open on a migration model, immigration policy should be alive to these things. So, I mean, to be fair, Connor, it's of duty to the wider family as well. So particularly West African migration. If you go to a small town in Ghana and you've got a few businesses, quite often the businesses there are set up because brother or son has got a couriering job in Croydon and is sending which in Ghana and Seti is quite big money, and they can set a business up. So it works for family massively. And actually very few migrants from that society would come here not be burdened or fettered with quite big obligations to their family. But as an economic model for us, it's crazy, absolutely crazy, because not only do we depress wages here, not only do we fail to train our own people, we have a model which is bad for the balance of payments, obviously, because you're transferring wealth out. You're earning it here. You're creating basically an import. There you go.
Yeah, and the final example I'm going to use came out on the same day. So I don't know if you saw this tweet yesterday. There was a chap in a kafir in Brighton who was given British citizenship by the Brighton mayor, who himself is of an immigrant and Islamic background. And it reads, for audio listeners, "Yesterday I became British. I thought the ceremony will be nationalistic and a bit cringe until the Lord Mayor of Brighton started his speech with Al-Salam Alaikum." Yeah, you're not British. You're a paper citizen. Thank you for demonstrating your cringe for my country. I think you should have your citizenship revoked and returned instantly. But this all boils down to people will import the baggage of indigestible tribal allegiances, whether it's to family members overseas, whether it's to a foreign religion, whether it's to ethnic identity that they think is opposed to ours for colonial or even sort of skin color, surface level reasons. And so there are certain people that will never integrate. And so if you allow this to incorporate itself into British politics, it will take advantage of the very liberal, very individualistic instincts of British politics with its clannish structure, and then start taking the piss. So perhaps we shouldn't allow that to happen.
It's far from ideal, because the chap who's done that, he's smiling and he's obviously very happy to become British, but that entitles him to the social wage, which is, education and health benefits, housing possibly, but then has a pop at nationalistic and cringe. Well, I'd hope he would be nationalistic if he's going to become British, because the only hope this country has is a form of nationalism that can unite people. It maybe doesn't unite him, I don't know.
Yeah, I think...
Doesn't seem to.
No, he's the perfect example of what Douglas Murray once said. If you import the third world, you get the third world's problems.
I hope you appreciated that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, and if you want to see what else we're up to, you can always follow Connor's series, Tomlinson Talks, this one looking at the grooming gang scandal. And if you want to see all the other things we're putting out, you can always follow us on Twitter. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.